Welcome to Pathology Central, Key Concepts, Hemostasis Part 2. In Part 1, we finished off with our clot being stabilized and secure, and now it's time to talk about how that clot resolves. Now, it's important to recognize that these are not discrete events, that as coagulation begins, fibrinolysis also begins, because the body is constantly evaluating where it is. It can't get to a certain point and say, okay, now I need to start thinking about anticoagulation. You don't want things to get away from you. So these processes are all going on at the same time, and it's simply a balance that determines whether it's procoagulant or anticoagulant. So in this video, we're going to discuss the factors that limit coagulation, and more specifically, the role of the endothelium in anticoagulation. So these are, broadly speaking, the three things that are going to limit coagulation. The easiest one, and one that won't require much discussion at all, is dilution. So blood flow is going to wash away coagulation factors. So we discussed in the last video how these coagulation factors progress to create the thrombus, but with blood flow they'll be diluted away. So it's only in the setting of injury that you're going to have this accumulation. Next, we'll talk about the fibrinolytic cascade and endothelial factors in anticoagulation. So, the fibrinolytic cascade is essentially that we need to break down all that wonderful fibrin that we just put together in a coagulation cascade. And the way we do this is that plasminogen, which is inactive, is converted to plasmin, which is active. And plasmin will cleave fibrin, yielding what's called fibrin split products, or D-dimers. And this will play a role in your evaluation of patients who have disseminated intravascular coagulation. So you'll hear this term, fibrin split products, D-dimers. Now, there are two things that can cause conversion of plasminogen to plasmin, and the most important of these are the plasminogen activators, and the most important of the plasminogen activators is tissue plasminogen activator, or TPA. It's synthesized by the endothelium, and it's most active when bound to fibrin, which means it's great to use therapeutically because it's going to have its primary action in the area of a thrombus. Now, there's another pathway by which plasminogen can be activated to plasmin, and that's a factor 12 dependent pathway, but that's not nearly as important. Now, as always, we're going to have balance. So in addition to our fibrinolytic cascade, we have to have counter-regulatory measures, and these are going to be plasminogen activator inhibitors and alpha-2 antiplasmin. So let's take a look at a fantastic drawing by Dr. Abhijit Das from the 11th edition of Robinson Kumar Basic Pathology to see if we can put this all together. Now, ordinarily I like to begin on the left and move right, but we're going to start right here with TPA and urokinase, which are synthesized by the endothelium. And what they will do is they're going to come here. The little hot dog shaped things are plasminogen. And what TPA will do is it will activate the plasmin. So it will go from being a little rod here to being curved. So you can see here, for example, this is what free plasmin looks like. Okay, and what plasmin is going to do is going to begin dissolving the fibrin clot, releasing these fibrin degradation products. Okay, now let's come back over here to the left because we talked about the counter-regulatory measures. We have our plasminogen activator inhibitors, or PAIs. So if you have this upregulated, this is going to inhibit this, which is going to drive stabilization of the clot and not anticoagulation. Now, I also mentioned some other counter-regulatory measures. One is alpha-2 antiplasmin, which will bind to free plasmin and then inactivate it. Okay, so this really sums up everything that was on that previous slide. So this is just a good image to work on understanding the pathophysiology. Now let's talk about the endothelium and anticoagulation. Obviously, the primary and easiest thing to think about endothelium doing is that it forms a sheath that protects the intravascular space from the extravascular space. So the tissue factor and von Willebrand factor and all of that, collagen, none of that is exposed. So that's one thing endothelium does. But it also has platelet inhibitory effects as well as anticoagulant effects. So the platelet inhibitory effects is that endothelium can release prostacyclin, PGI2, nitric oxide, and adenosine diphosphatase. And all of these will act to prevent platelet aggregation and activation. Now, the anticoagulant effects are that endothelium can release thrombomodulin endothelial protein C receptor, heparin-like molecules, tissue factor pathway inhibitor, or TFPI, and tissue plasminogen activator, which we just discussed. So let's look a little bit more at the details of this, and then I'll take you again to another drawing. All right, so one of the things that endothelium can release is thrombomodulin. So thrombomodulin is made by the endothelium and it will bind thrombin. And when it does this, thrombin can no longer activate coagulation factors and platelets. So it no longer is procoagulant. Instead, thrombin when bound to thrombomodulin is going to activate protein C. Now, protein C will bind to endothelium protein C receptor, and with protein S will inhibit factors 5A and 7A, which you'll recall from the previous video are involved in driving you towards fibrin formation, is procoagulant. So by abrogating this effect, you are slowing down and becoming anticoagulant instead of procoagulant. Now the endothelium will also generate heparin-like molecules that will bind to antithrombin 3. And when this is done, we will be inhibiting thrombin and factors 9A, 10A, 11A, and 12A. So once more, driving us towards anticoagulation and not towards procoagulation. And then finally, the tissue factor pathway inhibitor plus protein S will inhibit tissue factor and factor 7-8 complex formation. Now this is a bunch of words. Let's take it to a picture. Okay, so here we have a heparin-like molecule on the surface of this endothelium. Antithrombin 3 will bind to it, and once bound to it, will inactivate thrombin and other coagulation factors. So this is going to be slowing, it will prevent you from going into the coagulation cascade, so it is anticoagulant. Tissue factor pathway inhibitor is going to directly inactivate tissue factor and 7A complexes. Now you recall that is part of what we consider the extrinsic pathway when we look at the in vitro coagulation. Now with thrombomodulin, also synthesized by the endothelium, which is going to bind to thrombin. This is going to activate protein C. And then we have a complex with endothelial protein C receptor when we bring in protein S, we're now going to inactivate factors 5A and 8A. Okay, so this is once more going to be preventing a move towards procoagulation. And then, as I mentioned before, the endothelial cells are going to be releasing PGI2, nitric oxide, and adenosine diphosphatase, all of which will inhibit platelet aggregation. And finally, TPA, which will activate fibrinolysis. So this is just putting it all together, all the things the endothelium is doing to prevent coagulation, because you can't have coagulation forming too quickly in the veins. You'll clot things off, and this is something that you will see in patients that have clotting diatheses. Let's finish up with just two questions for you to consider. What are the factors that limit coagulation, and how does the endothelium limit thrombosis? Both of these are good things to consider. As always, I really appreciate your comments down below to give me guidance on what is working and what isn't, and what topics you'd like for me to address. And thank you very much. Please subscribe, shoot me an email, follow me on Twitter, check out the website. And as always, have a great day.